Today in Avatar, we get an owl that I think might just be the most broken card from the entire set. A blue take on Mindslaver, a interesting twist on a black sweeper, and so much more. Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Avatar spoilers. So we've reached day 2 of spoiler season, and thankfully, we don't have nearly as many cards to talk about today as yesterday. Good lord, was that a lot of cards yesterday. But we have some of the most exciting stuff that we've seen from the set so far. And I gotta say, the more I see of this set, the more I really love it. We're only 2 days into spoilers, and there's already like 10 or more cards that I find way more exciting than any card from the entire Spider-Man set, which is definitely a good sign about where we're going with Avatar. But anyway, we got a bunch to talk about today, which means we should probably jump right into it. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Avatar. First up today, we get a card that is my early pick for most broken card from the entire set. This is a card that I think can be really good in Standard, also potentially very good in Modern and in Legacy, and definitely a Commander staple. And that card is Wan Shi Tong, Librarian. So this is a double blue and X, 1/1 legendary bird spirit. It has Flash, Flying, and Vigilance, so a ton of keywords. It says when it enters, you put X+1/+1 counters on it, and you draw half X cards rounded down, and then whenever an opponent searches their library, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and you draw a card. So this is essentially a split card of 2 incredibly powerful cards. So if you just cast this for 2 mana, it's essentially a blue Archivist of Ogma. And Archivist of Ogma is actually one of the most played white creatures in Commander. It's like a top 20 creature in the entire format. You just cast this for 2 mana in response to a fetch land or some sort of tutor, draw a card, put a counter on it, and you end up with essentially a 2-mana 2/2 flying that draws you a card more or less when it enters. And then if it sticks around and your opponents crack more fetches or tutor in other ways, you can draw even more cards. So its floor is Blue Archivist of Ogma, which is already a great card, but it's even better than that because this is also mono blue Hydroid Crosses, which if you're playing Standard, oh boy, almost a decade ago now. My god, it's been a while since we went to Ravnica Allegiance. But if you're playing Standard in like 2017, 2018, you will know that Hydroid Crosses was one of the best creatures in the format. And if you just dump all your mana into Wan Shi Tong, it's essentially the same card. You don't get to gain any life, and I guess you miss out on trample, but you get this massive flying creature that's going to get a ton of counters on it and probably refill your hand. So I think the combination of these 2 effects makes for a ridiculous card. In Standard, I'm mostly excited about this being a Hydroid Crosses, right? Where you can make a bunch of mana and you can cast this and draw 3 or 4 cards, get this massive flyer. In Standard, I don't think you're going to get that much value out of the when your opponent searches their library clause. I guess in theory, there's like Bright Glass Gearhulk, there's some green ram spells, some decks have Fabled Passage. So maybe like in very niche situations and matchups, maybe you get like 1 card out of the opponent searching their library thing. But I don't think that really matters. I guess if you want to go super deep, you can play with Demo Field and force your opponent to search their library as a way to trigger Wan Shi Tong. But I don't think you need to do that. I think you just play this in basically any deck, and it's going to be pretty solid. Like, if you're playing Dimir midrange, I could see playing one of these as kind of a finisher, right? Where it's fine on turn 2, and then later in the game, you can flash this in as like a 5/5 or something, and draw some cards and get this huge flying body. It works well with VV mana. I know VV's probably going to get banned, but it's another thing you can just dump all the ridiculous amount of mana that VV and the Cauldron creatures make into this one creature, draw a ton of cards, get this massive body. Great in ramp decks if you're playing Overlord of the Hauntwoods, think of like Simic Doppelgang style decks. It could even be a control finisher, so I feel like there's a ton of ways that you can play this card in Standard. We'll have to wait and see. Maybe Hydroid Crosses is not that good in 2025, but I have to think that this card, especially having Flash, which makes it so ridiculous, in a control deck you just leave leave up all your mana. If you need to counter something or kill something, you can. If you don't, then you just cast this on your opponent's end step with all your mana, refill your hand, and get this huge flyer. The card seems absolutely nuts to me, so I think it's a great standard card. Once you get back into older formats, the paradigm kind of changes. In standard, I'm interested in dumping a ton of mana into this. In modern and in legacy, I think this card is best as a 2-drop, really. I think you just play this with flash for 2 mana in response to your opponent cracking a fetch land, and the end result is essentially a 2-mana 2/2 Flying Vigilance that ETB draws you a card, and then you get the upside of it sticking and potentially drawing more cards when your opponent cracks more fetches. So that by itself seems really good. And then you also get the flexible upside where if you're playing Modern, you're not often going to be casting this for 6, 7, 8 mana. But there are going to be situations where the game goes long, you draw this off the top, and you're just like, all right, I got nothing better to do. I dump all my mana into it, which is so much better than Archivist of Agma. The problem with Archivist is it's great if you have it on turn 2, but if you draw it off the top in the late game, it's kind of like, it's just a 2/2. Maybe I get to cycle it if I get the timing right. But this is great on turn 2, and then also one of your best top decks on turn 10, because you can just put all your mana into it and refill your hand. So I think that makes this card crazy. It also is a blue card, so it pitches to Force of Will, it pitches to Force of Negation, it pitches to Subtlety, which might not seem like a huge deal, but when you're playing a format like Modern or Legacy, just upping your blue card count for your forces is actually very relevant in those formats. And then if you want to go super deep, you can try to like use Ghost Quarter to make your opponent either lose a land, either you get a strip mine, or they have to search their library to get a basic land. Maybe add an Ice Till Explorer, so you can be playing this from your graveyard, you're doing it multiple times each turn, and then you're just drawing a ton of cards. You're able to make this huge Wan Shi Tong, and attack your opponent's mana base. So I feel like that could be another strategy. There's so much potential for this card. If you want to go super deep, it works really well with Scheming Symmetry. Scheming Symmetry makes both players, well, 2 target players, search their library for a card, put it on top of their library, and then you also have to shuffle before you put the card on top. So with Wan Shi Tong, what you could do is cast a Scheming Symmetry. That's going to cause your opponent to search their library. You're also going to get to suit your library, but then Wan Shi Tong will trigger, and you'll draw that card right away, where your opponent won't get to draw that card until their next turn. And that's the biggest issue with Scheming Symmetry, is your opponent gets the card first. You cast it at sorcery speed. Unless you have a way to draw that card, your opponent untaps, gets whatever they tutored for, probably uses it to win the game or pull super far ahead. But if you have Wan Shi Tong, it doesn't actually matter because you get to get the card right away. So you essentially end up with like a 1 mana demonic tutor, but your opponent also will get to tutor a card that they use the next turn. In Commander, I think this card is just legitimately great. Like, Archivist of Agma is one of the best white creatures in Commander, most played white creatures in Commander. And Hydroid Crosses, maybe not a staple, but the flexibility of this, being an Archivist on turn 2 that is also a Crosses on turn 10, is just so impressive. So I actually think this is just a staple level card that you can literally play in any deck. The only downside of this card is it's not especially thematic, right? If you're playing Urza Lord High Artificer, I think the card is great in that deck, but it's not an artifact. It doesn't really synergize. If you're playing the Mind Skinner, a mill deck, I think that it's great in that deck, but it's not really a mill card. Or Talrand, a Spellslinger deck, I think Wan Shi Tong gonna be great in that deck too, but it doesn't really fit the theme. So this just feels like a generic staple to me that you can literally play in any deck possible, and it's going to be good. And it gets even better once you end up in multicolored decks, like in a Simic deck where you're generating huge amount of mana thanks to green. Then this card becomes even more impressive because the Hydroid Crosses mode is much more realistic, that you can cast this with flashes like, I don't know, a 10/10 and draw 5 cards, and they go on to win the game the next turn. So Wan Shi Tong, I think this card is just absolutely insane. Like, this is, I think, the broken card from the set. I think this is the legacy card from the set. I think this is one of the best standard cards from the set. The card is absolutely wild. I think it's going to be good in multiple formats. Maybe I'm too hyped for this card, but to me, this reads just like an insane piece of power creep card that is good basically everywhere. But let me know what you think about it in the comments. Maybe I'm too hyped for it, but my God, does this card seem crazy to me. We also got my favorite lesson of all time, Secrets of Bloodbending. So this is 4 blue mana for a lesson. It's a sorcery. It says, it's an additional cost to cast this spell. You can waterbend 10, so pay 10 mana, but you can also tap creatures and or artifacts to pay for that mana. It says you control target opponent during their next combat phase. If this spell's additional cost was paid, you control that player during their next turn instead, and then you exile Secrets of Bloodbending, so you can't loop it from the graveyard or whatever. So Secrets of Bloodbending, the best comparison I could find to the 4-mana mode isn't really a good one, but like Illusionist Gambit maybe. Essentially, it's 4 mana, you choose opponent that you're playing against, presumably in Commander, and you get to choose who they attack the next turn. So it works like a Fog, because you're definitely not going to choose to attack yourself, unless for some reason that's beneficial, but it's even better than that, because you get to choose who they attack. So if you're the archenemy and everyone wants to be attacking you, maybe you can like use someone else's creatures to kill one of your opponents before they get a chance to come at you with all their aggression. So I think the 4-mana mode, it's fine. It's awkward that it's sorcery speed, right? Like, you have to cast it during your turn, so you have to think ahead, like, what is Tomer gonna do in 2 turns? Whose turn is it best for me to gain control of their combat phase? So that part's a little awkward, but at 4 mana, the card it's kind of okay. Where it gets really exciting is when it's 14 mana, or some form of mana / waterbending, tapping your stuff to pay that cost, because then essentially you end up with Mono Blue Worst Fears or Mindslaver, and these cards are just super brutal. And I gotta say, in Standard, I think this is better than the last version of this effect that we got, which is the Dominion Bracelet, which is also a ridiculous amount of mana, but it requires you to have a huge creature on the battlefield as well. So I feel like Secret of Bloodbending is going to be easier than the Dominion Bracelet if your goal is to control your opponent's turn. I will say in a 1v1 format, the non-waterbend mode is actually pretty weak, because controlling your opponent's next combat is literally just going to be, well, maybe it's slightly better than a Fog, because you could attack with some creatures if you have good blocks to kill those creatures. So it's kind of like a super Fog, a Fog that might also be a removal spell in some situations, but you're not going to get as much value out of the controlling the combat step in a 1v1 format, but that mode gets very strong in a 4-player format. So I think that this card, as far as Standard is concerned, one of the things I'm excited about is, unlike the Dominion Bracelet, you can just ramp into this, right? You don't need to have a big creature on the battlefield. So it seems possible to me in Standard that with stuff like Overlord of the Hauntwoods and Doppelgang, we can actually just hard ramp up to 14 and start casting this. Obviously going to be more of like, you know, an against the odds type thing than a top tier thing in Standard, I assume. But still, that seems pretty powerful, that you can just ramp into this, start Mindslavering and Worst Fearing your opponent's turn. You can also try to do this with the Waterbend mode. You can use Collector's Vault to make a bunch of treasures, or Avatar Kurik to make a bunch of spirits, and use those to help pay for the cost. So that's a nice upside as well. Sadly, the card is not as good as Iroh Grandload is, as I was hoping. Yesterday we talked about how Iroh, in its ability to flashback lessons for a single mana during your turn, could be really powerful if we got some really big expensive lessons. But the way this card is worded with the extra waterbending cost, you can cast this from your graveyard with Iroh for 1 mana, but you're not going to get to control your opponent's entire turn. You're just going to control their combat phase. You could cast it, I believe, and still pay the waterbending cost if you had, you know, the extra mana around, but you're not going to be able to 1 mana just Mindslaver someone, as busted as that would be. As far as Commander is concerned, I actually don't think this card will see that much play. If you look at similar cards like Worst Fear and Mindslaver, most of the time people don't play these cards. I think in part because they're just kind of really mean and people don't consider them to be super fun. So I think that's part of the problem. They're also very expensive and not especially thematic in most decks. So I don't think this card is going to see a ton of Commander play, which is probably a good thing, because getting your turn stolen is absolutely brutal. Although there might be some decks that want this. We've seen in Avatar itself, cards that just care about lessons, commanders that care about lessons. So maybe in a lesson deck you play this just because it's a lesson. I think if you do want to play this, it's probably going to either be at its best in a super heavy ramp deck, or a deck that can make a bunch of tokens. So like Lannis Cryptozoologist, really good at just making a ton of clues, being able to tap all those clues to pay the waterbending cost and Mindslaver someone for 4 mana seems kind of ridiculous. Or Adrix and Nev can make a ton of tokens, Talrand can make a bunch of tokens. So I think those are the kind of homes that you're looking for. It also gets even funnier with like Elug, for example, can just reduce the blue mana costs of your spells, or Zevlar can potentially let you control all of your opponent's next turn. I imagine it shows up in Iroh as well, although as I mentioned in Standard, not as good as Iroh as you would want, but if you're playing Iroh, you're probably just going to play every good lesson possible, and even just being able to control one person's next combat for a single generic mana with flashback is still probably good enough to make it very good in an Iroh deck. So Secret of Bloodbending, I love this card. I love Mindslaver effects. It's going to be a fun challenge to build around. I think the card's probably not like super busted or a staple, but I think that's probably a good thing, because if we actually ended up in a standard where a Mindslaver effect was one of the best things in the format, I think people would be pretty unhappy with that. But is it cool against the odds deck building challenge? I love that this card exists. We also got Bumi Unleashed, which is kind of a ridiculous mid-range threat. It is a 5 mana, 5/4 in Gruul. It's a legendary human noble ally. It has trample. It says when it enters, Earthbend 4, and then when it deals combat damage to a player, untap all lands you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. Only land creatures can attack during that combat phase. So Bumi, this card adds a lot of stats to the battlefield. If you think about what this actually does, it's a 5 mana, 5-powered creature that is going to come along with a 4/4. So you're adding 9 power and 8 toughness to the battlefield for 5 mana, and then you're actually getting the additional upside of untapping your lands, potentially getting extra combat phases with your earthbended lands. So I think that's actually just a really good card. It reminds me kind of Broodmate Dragon, but it's kind of even better than Broodmate Dragon, because if you get up to 6 mana with Bumi, you can earthbend a land that was already on the battlefield, which essentially gives that land haste. You can smack your opponent for damage right away. So it's kind of a 5/4 that comes along with a hasty 4/4 if you get up to 6 mana. And we've seen other 5-drops that make a token be way less powerful than this, like Bear's Companion, a 5-drop 2/2 that makes a 4/4, Dragon Trainer, a 5-drop 1/1 that makes a flying 4/4. So just the raw amount of stats that Bumi adds to the battlefield is very above the curve, and I think that's enough to potentially make this into a good card. And that doesn't even consider that you get this weird Sword of Feast and Famine, untap all your lands mode, which is very powerful if you can actually pull it off, because you essentially double your mana for the turn. You can play a bunch of stuff pre-combat, get in with a land, untap all your lands, play a bunch of stuff post-combat, and then you even get this like mini Port Raiser effect where you can give your lands an extra combat phase, which I don't think is like super important. Like, I don't think you have to be some full-on attack with my lands and animate my land deck to make that good. Even just getting in an extra attack with the 4/4 land that it turns into a creature is still just a lot of damage. So I actually think this card has potential to be pretty good in Standard. Also notable that the Earthbend land does get around most removal. If you shoot the Sheriff it, it's going to come back into play. If you Rides on it, it's going to come back into play. Its only weakness is really bounce removal, like into the Flood Maw, where you don't even lose the land forever, but you are still down a land drop, because you're going to have to spend your land drop to put it back into play. But the resilience of the land is a big selling point here. So I think this card can just be a good mid-range threat. We've seen Roxanne Starfall Savant show up in a decent amount of decks in Standard, and if you're playing a Gruul deck, you're going to have Llanowar Elves, you're going to have stuff like Summon Fenrir that can ramp up to 5, maybe as early as turn 3, and I think that Bumi, it might not be a 4 of in these decks, but it just adds so much power to the battlefield that I feel like this is a very good mid-range threat. It also gets even better if you are a dedicated Earthbend deck. So the mid-range plan, you don't really care too much about the land shenanigans, like getting an extra combat with your land. Like I said, it's nice even if you just have this single Earthbend 4/4, but it's not really a big deal. On the other hand, if you're playing a straight up Earthbend deck, then being able to untap all your lands and get an extra combat with them can't just be game ending, right? If you got a bunch of these Earthbend lands, from Earthbending Lesson and Earthbending Student and Toph, then this becomes a pretty game ending play. You can also use other cards that turn your lands into creatures. Remember, all of your lands are going to untap. All of your land creatures are going to get extra combat. So if you're playing caves, you can like Kazium Confluence to make this massive cave land. There's straight up creature lands like Restless Ridgeline and Soulstone Sanctuary. So if you got Bumi in your deck and you're building around it, all those cards go up in value as well. Once you get back to Commander, if you're building around Bumi, I think you really embrace the attacking with your land shenanigans. You got stuff like Ashaya that just turns all of your non-token creatures into lands. So suddenly, all of them are going to untap when Bumi deals combat damage. All of them are going to be able to attack during the extra combat phase. You have stuff like Nissu Shakes the World and other cards that can animate lands. Works really well with various Kamals that can easily turn your lands into creatures. So there's a lot of support for building around Bumi. I would also play it in the 99 of some other land animation decks. There's not a ton of them that are in the colors, like Abone Moldiah Ancestor, a land animation deck. Bumi's going to be perfect there. Toph, I think you would play Bumi and Toph as well. So Bumi, the card seems really good to me. Like, it just adds a ton of power to the battlefield, and then the sneaky land untapping extra combat is a nice upside as well. We also got a new sweeper that I don't know how good it is, but I'm very glad it exists in Day of the Black Sun. So Day of the Black Sun, double black and X for a sorcery that says each creature with mana value X or less loses all abilities until end of turn, and then destroy those creatures. So Day of the Black Sun, a very interesting, I think, safety valve style Wrath. So if you're looking for comparisons, there's not really a perfect one for this card. It reminds me a little bit of Grays of Granite, Wrath of Skies, but they hit non-creature permanents as well. Stuff like Black Sun Zenith or 0-Point Ballad, these Wraths that if you want to kill everything, you gotta dump a lot of mana into them, but if you can, you actually can Wrath the entire board. I think Day of the Black Sun kind of falls somewhere in this group. If you think about how it works, if you actually want to Wrath the entire board, and your opponent has, you know, a 4-drop, a 5-drop on the battlefield, it's gonna be 6 mana, 7 mana to actually kill everything, which is a lot of mana for a Wrath. On the other hand, if you're just trying to get rid of a bunch of 2-drops or 1-drops against an aggro deck, or even like an aristocrat deck, getting up to 3 to get rid of Sephiroth, then this can be relatively efficient. And the upside of having creatures lose all abilities, the dress down mode on this card, is actually very relevant in some matchups. So I think the biggest reason I'm excited for this card is it's a nice safety valve in case some sort of aristocrats deck gets too good, some sort of Sephiroth deck, some sort of Blood Artist deck, because making all creatures lose all abilities means that you blow up the entire board and the Sephiroth's not going to trigger, the Blood Artist not going to trigger. So if that becomes a thing in Standard, it's relevant. If you got a Commander playgroup where there's a lot of aristocrats, it's relevant. It also lets you get rid of indestructible creatures. Obviously, to kill a Blightsteel Colossus, you're going to need like 14 mana, which is a ton, but it blows up indestructible creatures. It gets around stuff like Enduring Curiosity coming back into play because it's going to lose that ability. So in certain matchups, making creatures lose all abilities before blowing them up is actually very important. It is a little awkward against aristocrats that if they have a sack outlet out, they can just sack their entire board to get their death triggers before Day of the Black Sun resolves, but still it is a very good answer to those decks. So where does this card fit in Standard? Outside of hosing Sephiroth decks, which I think is its main purpose, it seems like a good sideboard card against aggro. Like, if your opponent's deck is mostly topping out at 2 mana or 3 mana, then this is going to be 4 or 5 mana to Wrath the entire board, which seems fine. Plus you can cast it for 3 mana just to get rid of all the 1-drops. This seems fine. Also very good against token decks. Cosmic Grand Zenith, Simium Lacrum Synthesizer. Against tokens, you can just pay 2 mana and blow up all the tokens because they have no mana value. So that seems very powerful as well. Once you get back to Commander, so being able to get rid of all the tokens for just 2 mana is pretty powerful as well. Once you get back to Commander, I think whether you want this card really depends on what your playgroup and your metagame looks like. So I will say, if I was just building a random black deck to take to like a Magic Con to play in a random meta, I don't think I would play Day of the Black Sun most of the time, because I think there's just enough other good Wraths, Toxic Deluge, Damnation, Villainous Wrath, Blasphemous Edict, that it's probably not going to make the cut for me, unless I know it's actually hating on something specific. If you think about other similar Wraths that cost a lot of mana to actually get rid of the entire board, like Black Sun Zenith or 0-Point Ballad, they're cards that don't really see that much play in Commander, because you can just play the other options. But if you're in a playgroup where you have a Sephiroth player, or you got that one guy that always plays aristocrats, then I think this is a card that goes way up in value compared to the other Wraths, and then I probably would play it in most of my decks if that was the playgroup I was playing in. There's also some other upside just in black decks that make a ton of mana. I think that's the other variable here. If you're a black ramp deck with coffers and a bunch of crypt gas and you're just trying to make a ton of mana, then I think it gets a little bit better because there is real upside here. I think the same goes for like Golgari decks where you have the green ramp. It gets much easier to cast this for 8 or 9 mana. But one of the other upsides is this is a Wrath that gets around heroic interventions and Boros charms. A lot of the best protection spells that people use. Doesn't stop Teferi's Protection or Clever Concealment from phasing stuff out, but if you cast a big Day of the Black Sun and your opponent has heroic intervention, it doesn't really do anything. If they cast it in response, then Day of the Black Sun is just going to make all their stuff lose indestructible anyway, and all its other abilities. So there's not really any way to save your board with a heroic intervention or Boros charm through a Day of the Black Sun. So that is an upside as well. But again, to get the whole board, you're going to need a lot of mana. So Day of the Black Sun, I love that this card exists. I feel like this is the kind of answer I want to see to stuff like aristocrats and indestructible creatures. Personally, I found cards like Farewells and Sunfalls to be the wrong way to go about it, because I feel like it answers those things too harshly. Like, not only do you answer them once, they're exiled forever. So yeah, you get around the death triggers, but you also can't reanimate them, you can't recur them in any way. I feel like making creatures lose all abilities and then blowing up the board is actually a really sneaky way to still hate on those same things. The aristocrat decks, the decks with, hexproof indestructible creatures or whatever. So it hates on similar stuff, but it's not going to hate on stuff quite as harshly, which I think is actually a positive overall. We also got a new red saga in the Legend of Roku that flips into Avatar Roku. So Legend of Roku, a 4-mana red saga. Lore counter number 1, exile top 3 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play those cards. Lore counter number 2. Add 1 mana of any color. It's a pretty powerful chapter of that saga. And then lore counter number 3, you exile it, flip it around transformed into Avatar Roku, a 4/4 with Firebending 4 that lets you pay 8 to make a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying and Firebending 4. So Legend of Roku, this card actually interests me. The saga side of this card, kind of similar to Showdown of the Skalds, which saw a lot of play in Standard, actually, not super long ago. Yes, you only get to exile 3 cards rather than 4 cards, but still, it's pretty similar. Also kind of similar to, like, Glimpse the Impossible. The second lore counter, getting a single mana, whatever. I guess it lets you help cast the cards that you exiled before. Also worth mentioning that we've seen a little bit of playing from exile matters with Firebending already in Firelord Zuko, that whenever you cast a spell from exile or a permanent enters from exile, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, which then grows Firelord Zuko's power to firebend even more, and then the firebending mana lets you activate Avatar Roku to make more dragons that have firebending that can then make more dragons the next turn. So it does seem like it kind of snowballs nicely into what some sort of like Firelord Zuko firebending deck would want to be doing in Standard. So I think it does fit in there just because of its synergies with Firelord Zuko as well. The backside of the card, I think, is also very powerful in a Firebending deck. Firebending 4 is the biggest number we've seen so far, tied with Oze that we talked about yesterday. And then I know that paying 8 to make a 4/4 red dragon seems kind of bad when you can, like, exhaust a Dragnotics Engineer for just 4 mana, but you gotta remember that in the context of Firebending, this ability becomes much stronger. Like, a single attack with Avatar Roku makes 4 mana, that's already half of what you need to make a dragon. If you also have a Oze out or something, you make 8 mana, you can make a dragon just with your Firebending mana, and then it's even better than that because those dragons will also snowball. So if the game's still going the next turn, when you attack with the dragons, you're going to get 4 mana from each of those dragons that attack, which then you can use to make even more dragons, so it snowballs really hard once it gets going. So I actually think this card might be kind of good. My only catch is, it is 4 mana, it is kind of slow. When I think about Standard right now, I sometimes wonder if we're in a world where 4-drops are even playable. Like, we were talking on the podcast about if Screaming Nemesis could be too slow for Standard, which is just wild. So that's my only concern, is this is a slow card, right? It's 4 mana to cast, you gotta wait 2 more turns to actually flip into the creature side, and then the way it transforms, it exiles, so that means the turn that you flip into Avatar Roku, you can't attack with it because it's gonna be summoning sick. So when you add all that together, it might just be too slow to actually be really good in Standard, but I think it's a very, very powerful effect. Once you start building around it, it just becomes even crazier, right? We've seen like Sozin's Comet, Firebending Student, these firebending cards that can make a huge amount of mana. In a deck that's built around it, you could be activating that pay 8, make a dragon mode multiple times in a single turn with your firebending mana, and that is a really, really powerful swing. We've also seen Showdown of the Skalds, which I mentioned before. When it was in Standard, the way it was most commonly played was as kind of a sideboard card for aggro decks to fight against control decks, where your opponent's killing all your stuff, you stick a Showdown, you draw a bunch of cards, you play them, and I think the Legend of Roku could do something similar in a mono red deck today, where this can come in out of the sideboard, it gives you some card advantage, and then eventually flips around into a pretty powerful creature that, if it sticks, can take over the game all on its own. We also have a few other cards in Standard that care about stuff being played from exile: Ghost Spider, Quintorius Con. Not sure there's enough to really make a deck around it at this point, but if there is, then Legend of Roku goes up in value even more thanks to the Impulse draw. And Commander, I mean, good and prosper, right? It's good in decks where you want to play from exile because it's another way that you can exile cards, and the backside's pretty good. But I could also see just playing this in like a dragon deck, or definitely in a firebending deck. So I think the Legend of Roku, actually a pretty sweet card. I think it could have a chance in standard, although, like I said, I am a little worried that current standard is just so incredibly fast that even though I think this card is powerful enough to be standard playable, with so many cards in standard and the power level is so high and games ending on turn 4, can I really play a Saga on turn 4 that's going to set me up to have a really good turn 5, a really good turn 6? I hope so. I would like to say that that's what standard is about. That's what standard I think should be about. Whether it's actually about that in 2025, that's another question. So I hope that this card is good in standard. We'll have to wait and see if it actually lines up with the meta, but worst case, it is a really fun design. We also got the Diligent Zookeeper, a 4-mana 4/4 human citizen ally that says each non-human creature you control gets +1/+1 for each of its creature types to a maximum of 10. So I don't know if we've ever had a maximum of 10 restriction or maximum of anything restriction on a card before. I'm sure there is that I'm not thinking of, but it seems like a very rare restriction to me. And I was trying to figure out why is that necessary, because it seems like there's multiple safety valves with the non-human thing to try to make sure that it's not going to be too busted. But I don't know. We'll talk about it as we go along. So Diligent Zookeeper, obviously number one, the non-human clause means that it doesn't absolutely break changelings. If there was not the non-human clause, this would just make any changeling that you had, which is all creature types, into power and toughness equal to the number of creature types that exist in Magic, which I think someone said is like 307, maybe 308. So essentially all your changelings would get plus 300 something, plus 300 something. So that's safety valve number one. Only applying to non-human creatures means that your changelings are not super broken with this. Kind of reminiscent a little bit of Embiggen, which until end of turn gave target non-Bushwag creature +1/+1 for each super type, card type, and subtype that it has. So it's kind of like a similar restriction where we saw the non-Bushwag thing make this card not be super broken in like a turn 2 kill with changelings. Same kind of idea with Diligent Zookeeper. So how can you break this card? And I think the most powerful thing you can do with it, and you gotta jump through a lot of hoops, but Werewolf Pack Leader. I think Werewolf Pack Leader is the card that made Wizards put the maximum of 10 on there, and also probably just future-proofing, because who knows what they're going to print in the future. We're getting more and more creature types, we're getting more weird designs, but Werewolf Pack Leader is a 2-mana 3/3 that has an ability where you can pay 4 mana until end of turn. It has base power and toughness of 5/3, gains trample, and notably isn't a human. And that's the important line of text on this card. So the trick here is you could use something like Wings of Velisval or Rune Statellite that'll turn a creature into all creature types. It essentially gives the creature changeling. So if you get one of those on Werewolf Pack Leader, it'll be all creature types. But then if you activate Werewolf Pack Leader's ability, it specifically is not a human, so that will overwrite the Statellite or the Wings of Velisval until end of turn. So you end up with a Werewolf Pack Leader that is every creature type in Magic except for human. And if this scenario actually happened in a game, this would lead to, I guess, someone trying to count how many creature types exist in Magic, like pulling up Scryfall and going through the huge list of creature types to try to figure out the power and toughness. So I think just capping it at 10 just solves that situation. Like if someone does pull off Werewolf Pack Leader Rune Statellite combo, it's just giving your Werewolf Pack Leader +10/+10. Don't worry about it. You don't got to count all the creature types in Magic. So I think that was the other safety valve on the card. The question is this card actually good? And I think the answer is, it's fun. Like, I don't think it's probably a great standard card, but maybe we are getting more and more creature types on cards these days. Like, we just saw Leonardo from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle set, which is a Mutant Ninja Turtle Samurai. So in the current era of Magic, getting 4 creature types on a creature is not out of the question. So if you can actually focus on making sure your creatures have as many creature types as possible, but are not humans, then you could build a deck where, like, this gives most of your creatures +3/+3 or +4/+4. There's not a ton of cards with 4 creature types. Most of them are these weird party cards that like get all the party creature types, like Stonework Pack Beast, Tajuro Paragon. But then we did get Leonardo that just straight up has 4 on it. So that's kind of the normal cap, I would say, is 4 creature types. And there's only like 15 creatures or something in Magic that have 4 creature types. If you think about it though, this could maybe be a standard card. My main catch is it's 4 mana. If this was like a 2-drop or a 3-drop, I'd be much more excited about it. But if you just look at like Simic and Standard, you have Llanowar Elf with 2 creature types, Paw Patch Recruit, 2 creature types, Sentinels of the Nameless City, 3 creature types, Aboroid, 2 creature types. So most of your deck is going to be getting +2/+2 or +3/3 from this. Yes, there are a couple of non-bows. Jackal is a human, Sirach is a human, so you'd have to take those out of the deck or just accept the fact that your Diligent Zookeeper is not going to pump them. The other question would be like, is it better than just playing a Boroid? Like, if you want to pump your team with a green 4-drop, is it better to play Vigilant Zookeeper, which can still just die and the buff will go away? Or is it better to play something like a Boroid, which might not buff as much the first turn that you play it, but the counters are permanent, so even if a Boroid ends up dying in the future, you're still going to have a larger team? I would imagine the answer is a Boroid, just because how ridiculously that card snowballs. So I don't know if this is actually a competitive standard card, but it does seem like a funny build around in Commander at least. The other thing I wanted to mention about this card is if you are going to play this in Commander, you really got to be sure to look up the Oracle text on cards. I think one of the easiest examples of this is Wrath the Assassin. Wrath the Assassin, if you just look at the card, it's a mercenary, right? But over the years, it has been updated multiple times to also be a zombie and also be an assassin. So even though there's only 1 creature type printed on the card itself, it actually has 3 non-human creature types, which means it actually should be getting +3/+3 from Zookeeper rather than +1/+1. So the card does interact a little bit awkwardly with all the creature type erratas over the years and cards just not having the right creature types printed on them, which might lead to some scryfalling, Googling, and Commander games, but something to be aware of if you do put this in your deck. Some of your creatures, especially if you're playing super old creatures, might be a little more powerful than you think they are. So Diligent Zookeeper, I think it's a funny design. I think the cap's funny. I think the pub's funny. It's got this interesting brew around where you're trying to figure out how many creature types. Is there a way I can combo with this? So I think it's an interesting card. As a 4-drop, I don't really think it's going to have an impact on Standard, but it could be fun to build around in Commander at least. I almost actually wish it was Legendary to make it more realistic to build around it in Commander, which is a funny request because normally I'm complaining about how many legends there are, but this effect in specific, I actually think would be interesting on a Commander because it's going to be hard to build around this card in the 99. Rounding things out today, we got some more of the basics from the set, which actually look pretty nice, I think. I like the art style on them at least. And then a handful of lower rarity cards, which worth knowing, at least for limited. Maybe the most interesting of the bunch is Seismic Sense, which I'm not really sure how good that card is. It's a 1 mana lesson. It's a green card. It says, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of lands you control. You can reveal a creature land card from among them, put them in the hand, the rest go on the bottom in a random order. So Seismic Sense, it's kind of weird. We see cards that are 1 mana that dig like 4 or 5 deep to grab a creature. There might be some that get creature or land for that price. So on turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, I think this is worse than other options. But then in the late game, if you got 5 lands or 10 lands, this almost turns into a tutor where you're going to be able to dig so deep, you should be able to find what you want. So I'm curious if it's going to be good enough. I feel like normally you want to cast your cantrips early in the game to set things up. So maybe that makes this card not very good just because on turn 1, this is like horrible, right? You're looking at 1 card and just hoping it's a creature or a land. So that's not very exciting, but I'm curious what y'all think of that one, if it has more potential. Plus, it is a lesson, which we've seen some cards just care about having lessons in the graveyard. So maybe it's going to be good for that reason, but anyway, those are our Avatar spoilers for today. Let me know what you think in the comments. I gotta say, that Blue Mythic, the owl, is so ridiculous. Am I off base on that? Is that card not one of the most ridiculous creatures they have printed in a while? What's your favorite card? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be back tomorrow to talk even more Avatar spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, everyone, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can find yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe check out the video about the most broken combos in the history of Magic the Gathering.